So welcome everyone to the third AviaDev Europe webinar. I guess the most of people in the audience already know me, but those of you who don't know me, my name is Juraj Toth and I'm a managing director at AviaDev Europe. AviaDev Europe is a route development forum focused on developing connectivity of European regional airports by providing the platform to network, negotiate new routes and exchange experiences and ideas between professionals from the airports, airlines, the tourism authorities, and aviation suppliers. And after organizing two successful events in Valencia, AviaDev Europe 2020 is planned to be held this November, and we will reveal the dates and location as soon as possible. At AviaDev, we try to stay with the community on a year-round basis, so that's why we do these webinars, and that's why we also have two podcast shows. AviaDev Inside Europe with almost 70 episodes and AviaDev Weekly News with exactly 20 episodes. Actually, all of our four speakers today have already been at least once on the shows. So that's great that we have them together at the webinar today. Both shows, both AviaDev Inside Europe podcast and AviaDev Weekly News podcast, are available on many platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to me, podcast is just a great medium because you can listen and your hands are free, so you can move the lawn, wash the dishes, walk the dog, or hit your workout, and at the same time listen to some interesting aviation content in this case. The history of the world will be divided before and after the COVID-19 outbreak. Of course, as always, our thoughts and prayers are with those who are fighting the virus in the first line all over the world, and we appreciate the whole supply chain of the aviation industry is going through something that nobody has ever seen before. With saying that, we're confident that we will get out of it. The crisis won't be here forever. It will eventually pass and people will fly again. So today, on our last webinar before the Easter holiday, we try to focus on the silver lining of the COVID-19 outbreak, however difficult it may sound. There are some powerful stories of inspiration, positivity, optimism, and hope in all this. And before I will introduce our today's speakers, let me do the quick technical housekeeping for today's webinar. As always, only our panelists and myself are able to use the microphones. Of course, all of you who are joining us in the audience, you can use the Q&A button, which is on the bottom. Your screen should be on the bottom and left. So use the Q&A button to ask questions to our panelists. The whole today's sessions, as always, will be recorded, and we will put it on both YouTube and on our podcast, so you will be able to watch or listen it again, whatever you prefer. And of course, you can also share it with your friends and colleagues who are not able to join us live today. Make yourself comfortable. We are about to start, but one last thing before I will open the floor to our panelists, and that's a poll. So that's another way how you can share your opinion with us, how you can be engaged by voting in a poll. And I will share the first poll with you in a second. Now let me welcome the speakers. So we have Joanna Bailey with us today, editor at SimpliFlying, the world's largest aviation news website. Hello, Joe.
Hi.
We have also Chloe Greenbank, editor at Regional Gateway, the only media portfolio dedicated exclusively to regional, business and secondary airports. Hi, Chloe.
Hi.
We also have Dirk, head of sustainability at SimpliFlying, the world's leading airline marketing strategy firm. Please mind there are more differences between SimpliFlying and SimpliFlying than just one letter. And of course, we have the one and only Max Oldorf, Chief Commercial Officer at CH Aviation, an influential airline intelligence provider, and as they say, one of the very few Swiss aviation success stories. So
there's 2-3 more, but yeah.
So before I will hand over to Joe, let me do the quick poll. It's a very simple question. Do you consider yourself as an AvGeek? So just to know how many AvGeeks do we have with us today, because we will talk about it later today, and also I have something to share with you at the end of this session, which also is related to.
This is mean. Panelists can't vote.
That's right, panelists can't vote. Yeah, but yeah, I definitely know what your answer would be, Max. What about the rest of you guys? You consider yourself AvGeeks, Chloe?
I try.
Joe,
Same.
I think
Yeah, same.
Dirk?
It's kind of a subjective term. Probably to the person on the street, absolutely. Probably to some of the panelists, some of the guests, not so much.
Yeah, okay, so let me end the polling and let me share the results with you. Well, I think we have more AvGeeks with us. So just 56% consider themselves as 100% AvGeek. So at 37%, it depends on the mood. So
depends on the plane, probably.
oh yeah, that can be the case as well.
It depends if the seat next to you is empty or not.
Who you're with, it depends on who you're with.
Okay, so again, everybody, welcome to the webinar. Joe, let's start with you. As I know, you have a couple of interesting tips for all of the AvGeeks out there, and of course, not just for them.
Thanks, Juraj, and thanks for having me on. So it was a bit of a challenge to try and find the silver linings inside the terrible coronavirus epidemic that is really decimating the aviation industry at the moment. But there are some really cool stories and really interesting stories actually that are coming out of this. So for my part of the webinar, I decided to focus on three key areas. The first thing, which we're going to talk about now, is the good news for stranded passengers and for us as AvGeeks and perhaps plane spotters. The other sections I'm going to cover a bit later includes the good news for the environment and the good news for the aviation industry in terms of how airlines are really coming together for the good of people and the wider environment. So my first slide here, it's really just photographs, but it's better than looking at my face. So this is all about the good news for stranded passengers and AvGeeks. And this particular flight I've pulled out was SAS, and they last week completed their longest ever flight. And they took one of their nice shiny new A350-900s all the way down to Peru, to Lima. So the flight was over 11,000 kilometers each way and was reportedly almost full to capacity, repatriating stranded Scandinavians back home. So they traveled from Copenhagen to Lima and back, and that made it the longest non-stop flight in the history of that airline, and it's been going for over 7 decades. So it's quite a landmark for SAS. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Juraj? So you may have heard about the difficulties that cruise operators have had in trying to dock their ships, trying to get their passengers home, and it's even been heard that some airlines have refused to fly staff and passengers back to their homes. So really tricky situations for these cruise ships full of thousands of people. Earlier in the month, we noted a British Airways flight where they flew 3 777s all in a line down to Havana to rescue some cruise ship passengers. And just this weekend just gone, I wanted to highlight this effort by Ethiopian Airlines. They sent 4 777s down to New Orleans to bring home cruise ship employees. So unlike BA, who flew their 777s in a convoy from Heathrow, Ethiopian had to position their aircraft from a variety of different bases. There was one came in from Stockholm, one came direct from Addis Ababa, another one came from Addis via Dublin, and another one came from Frankfurt. But they all kind of arrived at the same time. It was really cool to watch on Flight Radar. And as you can see from the Flight Radar image I've popped up there, they kind of flew back to Ethiopia in a convoy. And again, you know, these planes were almost full to capacity. So the fact that there were kind of 4 777s worth of cruise ship staff stuck in New Orleans, it was great to see Ethiopians stepping up to repatriate those people. And the next one, please, Juraj. So another European airline clocked up a longest ever flight last week as well, and this was Swiss, who is a favourite at SimpliFlying due to their proliferations of the lovely A220. And they flew down to Santiago de Chile to bring back some Swiss travellers. They also flew a 777, just one of them this time though. It was a 2-year-old 777, and it was a 7.5-hour flight, so it was the longest non-stop flight ever operated by Swiss. So, you know, for AvGeeks, it's really exciting to see some of these flights happening. It's disappointing that they have to happen, but it's great to see the effort that airlines are going to. And to be honest, this is just really a small selection of some of the incredible efforts we've seen by airlines over the last few weeks. There have been so many more. Just to highlight a few kind of interesting ones from our point of view. That's for the next one, Juraj, if you could go back. Save that one for next time. Air New Zealand, for example, made an appearance in Frankfurt. Austrian flew a huge route direct from Vienna to Sydney. Just yesterday, we heard that Lufthansa is planning to fly 5 A380s and 5 747s down to Auckland and Christchurch in New Zealand to bring stranded passengers back home. So, you know, there must be an immense amount of stranded Germans in New Zealand right now. And KLM flew a 777 to Sydney for the first time in 20 years last week. And of course, it's not just the big mainline airlines that we're really seeing pulling out all the stops. German airline Condor operated from Phuket to Perth, and it even set up its own temporary base in Phuket to facilitate that flight. Wizz Air has been really busy as well, operating repatriation flights. They're actually operating on behalf of a number of Eastern European nations that don't necessarily kind of have their own incumbent airline. And Wizz was actually seen whizzing around the US, operating some domestic flights last week on its kind of repatriation route. And, you know, other mentions, Air Serbia has been really active. They flew an A330 to Los Angeles last week. So, you know, it's great news for passengers who are looking for ways to get home. And for us AvGeeks, or you 53% of AvGeeks out there, it's really interesting to see some new liveries at your local airports, I'm sure. Thank you, Juraj, that's it. That's for the next segment that you wanted to talk about later. So I don't know if you can maybe move that into the next bit.
Okay, of course. Thanks a lot, Joe, for
No
some
problem.
very interesting information. Now I will hand over to Dirk Singer. You guys at SimpliFlying, you've been following the airlines from a little bit different perspective. Especially how they handle the communication in crisis, so from the corporate governance perspective. So what do you have to share with us on that topic today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we are, you know, a strategic marketing consultancy for the aviation industry, and we also publish a magazine which I edit called Airline Marketing Monthly, which you know, which looks at months worth of airline airport campaigns. Of course, at the moment there's not a great deal of that going on, so some airlines are doing, you know, certain bits and pieces. But that's right. I mean, two things that have really been of interest to us over the past month or so has been the effect on corporate governments, and also the effect on an area that I look after, sustainability and the environment. And I do think that when it comes to corporate governments, we could see an improvement in consumer standards and the way that, you know, businesses are run. Now, this is very much, I'll take a step back, this is very much a US and UK issue. So maybe some of the panel and some of the guests could say to what extent this is being replicated in continental Europe. But obviously, to first of all set the scene, is that certainly in the United States and in the United Kingdom, there's been a certain resistance to bailouts, you know, when airlines have asked for loans or have asked for public money. And I guess it's worth looking at why this is, you know, why a lot of media commentators in Britain and America have been so hostile to the idea, and why there's been quite a hostile response in social media. And really it comes down to, you know, two things, which is standards and business practices. And I think that at the end of this is we'll see, you know, some number of improvement in both. But to take each of these in turn, first of all, standards. Now, obviously, over the past decade, or over the past, you know, 12 years since the last time we had a major crisis in the 2008 financial crash, a lot of airlines have spent a lot of, you know, time and money and resources in making people at the front happy, while, you know, squeezing standards of, you know, of those of us who normally fly at the back. And you've got numerous examples from the airline world where, you know, where premium class offerings have been, you know, have been enhanced through, you know, through fancy lie-flat seats or chefs preparing meals, while, you know, well, let's say, you know, if you take the 777s, while they've been densified in the back, or in the case of American, you know, installing restrooms that are so tiny that the crew even started complaining. Then, of course, you've got an overall reduction in standards, such as taking away free food in economy, or reducing the seat pitch, or trying to squeeze passengers for ancillary revenues. I think that the traveling public has noticed this. Now, of course, the issue that we have is that many of the profits of the industry come from people in the front, but 90% of voters and so 90% of taxpayers sit in the back, and it's their taxpayers' money that's being used for bailouts, and and a lot of the traveling public remembers, and they remember the sort of the reduction in standards that they've experienced, or let's say some possibly customer service issues over the past few years. The second thing added to that is obviously what you can consider, sharp business practices, where a light has been shone on some of the things that airlines, particularly the United States, have been doing. So in the US, of course, you've got examples of airlines and also Boeing, plowing a lot of their money into share buybacks, which do three things. I mean, they enrich shareholders, they enrich the executives, and they artificially pump up the share price. Meanwhile, here in the UK, to give two examples, you had the case 2 weeks ago of EasyJet paying out £117 million worth of dividends to shareholders, including, of course, £60 million to the founder, so Stelios, who's tax domiciled in Monte Carlo, while at the same time suggesting that crews should no longer get a free meal on shifts. They should take 3 months unpaid leave, while also asking for government loans. And I gather that they've actually put in their application for government loans yesterday. Now, even though EasyJet said that the dividends had been declared and so had to be paid out, the optics of this obviously were awful. Because the optics are, on one hand, you're telling your hardworking cabin crew member that he or she can no longer have a sandwich on the flight, and on the other hand, you're paying £60 million to your founder who lives in Monte Carlo for tax purposes, while suggesting that staff cuts take unpaid leave. And this was a PR disaster for the airline here in the UK. Then, of course, you had the example of Virgin Atlantic. Virgin Atlantic, of course, is not, according to media reports, not in the best state at the moment. Will need UK government funding to sort of keep alive. But again, in the media and also on social media, there's been a certain amount of commentary about Sir Richard Branson, of course, living on a private island in the Caribbean, again for tax purposes, and being worth an awful lot of money, while expecting staff to take unpaid leave. So I hope, and also I think, that the end result of this will result in better corporate governance, better transparency, better consumer standards, and certainly, if you look in the United States, airlines have, of course, already committed to no longer engaging in share buybacks as part of the sort of as part of the quid pro quo for getting government money. So I think that that's going to be an improvement for the better, for the traveling public, and also for the industry, and for the way a lot of these businesses are run. The second issue, which I'll tie up on, which I'll go into very briefly, is sustainability, and that's very much linked to corporate governance. Now, certainly before February, my view and a view of a lot of those of us in the industry was that sustainability was the issue that the industry had to face, because of course flight shaming at its core takes aim at the very business of flying, at the very business of how airlines make their money. And I think it's a mistake to think that this issue is going away. I think if anything, we're going to see an increase in pressure from environmental groups. And just yesterday, a coalition of groups called Stay Grounded, they published an open letter. Stay Grounded is very active in lobbying the European Union, for example, the European Commission, saying that airlines shouldn't get any public money until they've done two things: A, improved labor conditions, and B, made a commitment to reducing carbon emissions. So this issue is going to be with us in the long term, way beyond COVID-19 has passed. And I think one of the things that the airlines will have to look for post-COVID-19 in particular is the corporate market, because something that we noticed last year was that a lot of the progress when it comes to sustainability and cutting carbon emissions came from the corporate sector and from large businesses, and not so much from the consumer sector. Of course, a lot of corporates have instituted very tough carbon reduction standards. The most famous example being Microsoft, which got a lot of coverage in the US, in February, for announcing that it was going to try and become carbon negative. Now, if we look on ahead, those targets are still going to be in place. Major corporates are still going to be committed to, for doing something to sustainability, but there's going to be a second imperative that they have to meet, which is of course to cut costs. And one of the key ways that a large corporate can cut costs is by simply reducing staff travel. And so my view is that airlines which continue to be on the front foot when it comes to showing how they are being proactive in sustainability and a commitment to becoming carbon neutral will have an advantage in chasing after the certainly diminishing corporate travel budgets. And that's it from me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Just to follow up on what you said about EasyJet, and previously we also talked about them on our podcast, that regarding sustainability, their communication was quite impressive. So they announced that they will offset all of their flights and in general, the communication about their sustainability efforts was something that also you, in your communication at SimpliFlying, you were sharing that this is the way how to communicate as an airline. So how do you think that could happen? This what you have just described with the dividends.
Yeah, I mean, there's if you read the media in general, I mean, the Financial Times yesterday published quite a wide-ranging piece saying that business, governments, and business standards across the board, not just in aviation, will change, and there'll be a shift in the debate on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I mean, things like like universal basic income, which used to be quite a fringe idea. It's something which is coming to the fore. It's something that's being seriously discussed. And so I think that consumer attitudes will change, and they'll be looking for different standards from businesses. And certainly, of course, EasyJet found in their last quarterly results before COVID-19, I mean, they carried out passenger satisfaction surveys, and passengers who were aware of their carbon neutral target said that they were more likely to fly with the airline again than those who had no awareness of the steps that EasyJet was making. And that's a sort of a a proof point that that doing your bit for the environment and being strong for sustainability. I mean, it's a positive thing to do in its own right, but it will cause more consumers to gravitate towards you as well.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, Dirk. Chloe, now over to you. We have been talking a lot about the airlines recently, so you are here representing the airports. So I know at least about one specific example where you want to share with us that how an airport can really flexibly react on what's happening and play its role in fighting the crisis that we have around us.
Yeah, so just going back to Joe's message about finding the silver lining, it's certainly not easy, but there are certainly rays of hope there, and although there are no winners in this scenario, we are seeing how resilient the industry can be. And one of the airports that I'd like to talk about now is East Midlands Airport in the UK, which, although it's had a drop-off in passenger services, it's a cargo hub, and they've noted an uptick in their scheduled cargo services. So it's just interesting. They've their focus has shifted from people to products, really, and because of the central location in the UK, they're no more than a 4-hour drive away from 90% of the population in England and Wales. So they're able to facilitate services to ensure that they can keep supply chains moving, to deliver personal protective equipment for medical services, and also goods that people are ordering online. So they're really facilitating those essential services, but they're also able to take on the additional capacity because the airport is still open and operating 24 hours. They're able to accept flights that would be flying elsewhere in the UK and now can't. So they've sort of had to, although cargo was part of their activity anyway, they're diversifying and focusing more on that, and it's just showing that that there is still business out there, and there is still airports that are operating and carrying out those vital services.
That's very, very, very interesting. And do you have also other examples, I think particularly in UK, about how airports can be really creative and support their local communities?
Yeah, well, I think we know that Birmingham Airport, they're using, or they're discussing using, one of their aircraft hangars as a morgue. They're again thinking, kind of beyond normal passenger services. It's about diversifying. And I think that Max is going to touch on this as well, but also looking at, we've seen some extraordinary images of airports being used as giant parking lots for aircraft. And, according to IATA, there's more than 10,500 aircraft at the moment on the ground, so representing around 40% of the global fleet. And, there's a big question mark about, can airports accommodate these aircraft? A lot of airlines will want to keep their aircraft as close to their hub airports as possible, so they can ensure that these aircraft can be maintained and serviced. But, we can probably accommodate the aircraft on the ground, but in terms of ensuring that they're maintained, that cabins are sanitized, aircraft are cleaned, kept, protected from corrosion, these all services that can be maintained while these aircraft are on the ground. And also, what happens when we need to get these aircraft back up and running? How do, accessing each individual aircraft, how easy is that going to be? And do we have enough sort of staff to make sure they're up and flying again?
What I would be really interested to see is at which levels the airport are charging for aircraft parking these days, especially the ones who are pretty busy.
Yeah, I mean, there may be some people listening in who may correct me on this, but I understand that airports, major European airports, can charge around sort of 260 euros per hour for these aircraft, and obviously airports will be negotiating those fees and waiving them for some airlines. Normally an aircraft lands, they'll be paying landing fees, maintenance, ramp handling fees, and so airports are no longer getting all of that revenue. But they will be incurring costs by having these aircraft parked on their ground or within their facility. So they do need to recover those costs from somewhere. So it's not a question of them just waiving the fees completely. They will still need to keep recovering those costs.
Exactly. Thanks a lot, Chloe. Max, over to you. So as Chloe said, you will follow up on the airport side. I know you have some interesting figures to share with us.
Yeah, so I'm one of these guys that when things happen, I'm trying, as we try to and as we've learned, and then at some point try to make sense out of it. So it's a bit chaotic out there right now. So and obviously today's meeting or today's webinar is called the silver lining. So if we want to look at the silver lining, I brought a few numbers based on exactly that topic, the parked aircraft. And I have a slide where it shows the percentage based on continent of the parked and the active aircraft. Maybe you can bring that one up, and we can quickly go through it. Yeah, exactly. It's this one here. So Chloe mentioned those 10,000 aircraft. IATA believes that are parked. It's actually a bit more. So as of yesterday, we saw 17,000, almost 18,000 aircraft that are now parked for either storage or for maintenance on a global scale. And I mean, one thing we have to keep in mind, we're still, at least here in Europe, we are before season, right? So a percentage of these aircraft would have been parked anyway because they would have been not in service yet, or they would have been now before the summer in maintenance to get ready for summer. What I find very interesting on this slide here especially is that you can see Africa has taken out the most aircraft actually in percentage of grounded. So there is 74% of the African fleet now grounded. And that's only comparable to Europe and South America. So in Europe, obviously, it's obviously understandable why in Europe everything is grounded, because we are a hotspot for the pandemic, and there's not much going on. Everyone locked down. The travel demand literally just went away. So Africa is even a bit stronger. So I guess if we look at that, it's probably a correlation from traffic that should origin in Asia and Europe and North America towards Africa and back, that is just not happening anymore. And then obviously Africa also being even more careful. And I've tried to make sense out of that number, and it's probably also because the African market, you always have to be a bit more careful because cash reserves, government support, etc., is probably not as strong as in other parts of the world. I mean, it's remarkable that when we look at North America, there is still only 39% of the fleet grounded, so that they're either not aware yet of the events. I mean, they are behind the pandemic for about 2-3 weeks. Their government also spreaded more optimism. They have been very quick in implementing governmental help systems, and the airlines actually in North America know they can count on the government to bail them out. So in Europe, it's still unclear how the government support for the airlines will look like. So I guess the airlines in Europe are also more careful than in North America, where, you know, there is only 4 or 5 large airlines there. So they know they're so relevant for the system that they will be rescued at some point. So that's a very interesting number here, if we look at that. And then going back to the, and obviously also very interesting here is that the traffic has been reduced a lot more, but the airlines obviously try to keep as many planes in service as possible, but just flying them once a week or twice a week in order to reactivate them very, very quickly once the market picks up. And going back on that topic that Chloe brought up, if you go to the next slide, I brought the numbers, or actually it wasn't me, it was Simona's from our marketing team who prepared all these numbers. But if you look at this here, what you can see is that we made a list of the aircraft parked at the certain airports. And if you look at this, you can see that there is no European airport in the top 20 when we talk about largest numbers of parked aircraft. Obviously, the first 3 ones are obvious because they came from a very high level already. Roswell, Victorville, Marana. I mean, Kingman, Tucson. They are you know, they're role models for storage airports. So probably it would have been interesting to see how many aircraft flew there in the last few weeks that added up to these numbers. But obviously, most of these aircraft that are at that airports, they are facing a more uncertain destiny because they are already at a place where, you know, there are facilities to scrap them and to tear them down. Then if you would look like an airport like Dubai World, where there's 129 aircraft, and you can count off probably all 129 to be released into service pretty soon once it picks up again. And this is an interesting part because there's no European airport here. I mean, it's not like as a European airport, you can just switch your business model and you can say, oh, yeah, cool, that's it. There's no one want to fly anymore. Now I'll make a big special announcement. Everyone can park here. But the problem is that, you know, you also have to have the facilities at the airport that can maintain the aircraft and that can, you know, do the procedures for the parking programs and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like as an airport you can immediately switch over. If you don't have a maintenance company there or no facilities, you just can't become a parking. You can become it, but it gets a lot more bothersome for an airline to park your aircraft there. Just to give you an example, the Swiss, here in Switzerland, they flew the aircraft from Zurich, just from Kloten, just to Dübendorf, which is just, you know, for them it's opposite the street because, you know, it doesn't matter where the technicians go to keep them to keep the aircraft in flying conditions. So I think, and I know Joanna is showing us some of that later on. I think what you can really say is if an aircraft gets parked close to an airline's base or to an airline's hub, then it's most likely to get into service again. But if you see, for example, British Airways flying their 747s or so to Teruel, which is a scrapyard for airlines, for aircraft here in Europe, you can count on that aircraft being taken out of service. And yeah, I'm actually done with my stuff now, but it's probably also going back on what Dirk said, probably this is the best program right now to become better on sustainability, because we will see a lot of old airplanes going out of the fleets now.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Max. Very, very interesting figures. I'm sorry for some technical issues that you were not able to see the full slide, but I think that Max has described it really well. Before we move to the second round, I have a second poll to share with you, and we will talk about sustainability, which obviously Dirk has already started this discussion, and we have some questions in the audience as well, actually related exactly to the questions I would like to ask you in the poll. So I just launched the poll, and the question is, do you think the pressure on increasing the sustainability in aviation should be reversed in the post-corona world, following obviously the massive economic losses of the whole industry? So that's exactly on what Jürgen was asking in one of his questions. So it will be interesting to see what do you think. And so far it looks like that the highest number of votes gets to the answer number 3. So 5 seconds, so you can still vote. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you. So 15% think that yes, that airlines shouldn't be forced so much, and actually the airport as well, to focus on sustainability, because they will have other stuff to do actually to survive. But at the same time, 50% of audience today on today's webinar thinks that no, the sustainability should be still very strong focus on the whole industry. I mean, the idea of this question was from the news I heard yesterday, that actually European Commission is considering waiving the very ambitious targets on the e-mobility. So the car producers won't be pushed so hard to produce so many electric cars, because obviously they will have same as the aviation sector. They will have very massive economic problems to deal with. So, but I think that's something definitely interesting to think about. Okay, so that's the second poll today. Thanks a lot for voting, everyone. And now I will hand over back to Joe, where actually you will fits nicely to what we were talking about, and that's sustainability from a little bit different angle.
Yeah, thanks, Juraj. And just before we launch into this bit, on that question about whether sustainability should continue, I think, you know, in my opinion, it's going to be crucial that it does continue. You know, being more efficient as an airline and focusing on reducing things like fuel costs is going to be crucial as airlines come back online. Anyhow, let's move on. So this was the slide that you guys got a preview of earlier. So this is my sort of second topic, if you like, which is good news for the environment, because we're seeing an awful lot of early retirements of older aircraft. So less good for AvGeeks maybe, but great for the future aircraft fleet of the world. There really has been a notable uptick in early retirements of older planes. So as Max mentioned, British Airways was spotted sending 5 Boeing 737s to Teruel in Spain, which is, as he said, a well-known aircraft graveyard. The airline wasn't keen to confirm that this was for scrapping, but as Max said, you know, when it ends up in a place like that, you kind of know how the story ends. But you'll be glad to know it wasn't the historically liveried retro jets, which we've spotted parked in Bournemouth and Heathrow. So those 3 at least are getting a stay of execution for the time being. So this screenshot was actually from yesterday. Sorry, on the right-hand side, the left-hand side is the 747s going down to Teruel in Spain. And on the right-hand side, you'll see 6 A380s setting off from Heathrow to a French aircraft graveyard, and that's half of the British Airways A380 fleet. So again, the airline was reluctant to confirm that they're being permanently withdrawn, but you know, we're pretty confident that you're not going to see them back again. So really, it's a trend that we've been seeing all over the globe. Could you skip forward to my next one if you can find it, Juraj, please? So we've seen so many aircraft leaving fleets over the last few days and weeks. Virgin finally got rid of its old A340s that have been hanging around for a few months. American Airlines has confirmed that it will look at early retirement of around 100 aircraft. This includes its 757s and 767s. United Airlines has said it's not retiring anything yet, but if it does, it will be its 757s and 767s first. And it has firm plans to let go of all its 50-seater regional aircraft, including the CRJ 200s and the ERJ 145s, which are really unpopular with passengers. And if you've ever flown them, you'll know why. I've also popped up some pictures there of Air Transat's last A310 that flew its last flight at the end of March. KLM took its beautiful blue 747 out of service at the same time. You know, these older and less efficient aircraft were already marked for retirement, but the impact of coronavirus has really seen those plans accelerated. So it's not good news for spotters and those of us who happen to love these older and more unusual aircraft, but it is good for the environment and for the carbon footprint of the industry as a whole. So I don't need to tell you guys that the more modern iterations of these planes, their replacements and successors, you know, it's typically 20 to 25% better fuel efficiency. So, you know, it's going to help airlines on their way to achieving climate goals, and it's going to stamp down their operational costs when they do come back. So it's all predictions at the moment are looking like aviation will ramp back up slowly. It's not going to suddenly go from being loads of aircraft grounded to everyone coming back online at 100% again. So really there'll be no reason to bring these older aircraft back into service. And that's particularly, you know, if the 737 MAX comes back into service, it really sort of stamps out the need for the 757 to be brought back, for example. So from a passenger's point of view, I think it's good for us too, because we're going to end up with more modern, quieter, more comfortable aircraft to fly with the most modern cabins. Yeah, so, you know, that's my kind of take on it, is that we will see more of these older aircraft leaving fleets. And when the global fleet comes back online, it's going to look quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Joe. Dirk, over to you. You actually already touched the sustainability perspective on what we discussed, but I would, as you are, your job title actually is Head of Sustainability at SimpliFlying. I would let you to comment on the question I asked on the poll. What is your angle to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say two things. I mean, first of all, as Joe, you know, has sort of has talked about in detail, is that more fuel efficient aircraft that are better for the environment are simply cheaper to run. So there's that angle, number one. But number two, I think that the wider landscape is that there will be pressure on businesses as a whole, not just in aviation, to be better corporate citizens. And one of those things will be, you know, in sustainability and a commitment to the environment. And it comes back to what I said earlier about that corporates and businesses have been doing a lot of the running in terms of, you know, setting some quite tough internal carbon reduction targets. And one of the interesting things that I found, with the interesting trends, is how environmental pressure groups started changing their focus earlier this year. From noisy demonstrations which get which get a lot of coverage, to actually turning up at corporate headquarters. To give you one example, I mean, London City Airport, which I personally live quite close to. You know, there was a case in October where Extinction Rebellion, you know, turned up at London City Airport and caused a lot of noise. Jumped up and down on the check-in counters. Some of them even made their way into the airfield. But the police arrived. You know, after a few hours, they were gone, and there was a certain amount of disruption. So it was a short-term publicity stunt, you know, with questionable long-term effects. What they then did several weeks later is they turned up at the offices of the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, which is one of the investors of London City Airport, and they they had a picket line in front of the offices to target to target that business, and to try and put pressure on the fund to go against London City Airport's expansion plans. And I think, looking at the point of view of a sort of environmental campaigner, I obviously work in the industry just like everyone else. I want the industry to succeed. But if I was advising one of these groups, I would say that's probably the way to go, because that's the way that you're going to have more of an impact at a sort of targeting shareholders, turning up at shareholders meetings, putting pressure on boards, turning up to offices and things like that. And I think we will see a lot more of that going forward in 2021, 2022 onwards.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to see how this will evolve. Chloe, over to you. Back to the airports side of things. What I know that you want to talk about as well today is some new technology at the airports, which would potentially minimize the human-to-human contact. So, how do you see this airport future?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much new technology. We already have a lot of automated and self-service facilities within the airports. But I think we're starting to see, for example, in Hong Kong airport, there's some virus-killing robots being put into use in the airport to clean. They're being used to disinfect public areas such as toilets and general public areas within the airport. And they use UV light and air sterilizers to kill germs. But obviously, no humans going around having to clean. And also Etihad Airways is also trialing a new technology to identify medically at-risk passengers. So it will be a question of not so much determining which passengers have serious illnesses, but in fact just picking up on the early stages of illness. So they'll be able to monitor temperatures, heart rates, respiratory rates, and just be able to identify passengers that might be at risk and prevent them from travelling. So I think, or at least alert airport staff to go and to do further checks, and if those passengers shouldn't be travelling, then not having them travel. So I think, perhaps what we might see is a wider and faster adoption of automated and robotic services within airports. So it might be not just in terms of monitoring temperatures or cleaning, but also minimizing touch points within the airports, security checkpoints, using self-service, a lot more self-service facilities at bag drops, at check-in as well. I think it will just help reduce the human contact, but also it possibly will help reduce costs as well for airports as they try and emerge from this situation. Perhaps having accelerated the staff working from home or working remotely, whether they're in IT centres or non-customer facing staff working from home, it will perhaps accelerate that process and help reduce costs within the airports.
Do you think that within the next, 5 years or maybe even earlier, it can become a norm? Like we have seen the major shift in the airport security after 9/11. Is there something, do you see something similar happening to the airport infrastructure in terms of preventing passengers who are sick or flying?
Yeah, I think we will definitely see within the next sort of 5 to 10 years, there'll be a huge shift in the way we travel, full stop. I travelled through Heathrow Terminal 5 recently, and I did the pod parking. So, you go up, you don't see any human, you park your car, you get in a pod, it takes you to the airport, you go through the self-service check-in, you have minimal kind of human contact all the way through the journey. And I think that will become more and more the norm for sure.
Good. Thanks a lot for that. Max, back to you. I know you have a lot more figures to share with us today. So now in this case regarding the airline capacity for the next couple of weeks. So how do you see that?
Focused on the silver lining, right?
Of course.
So maybe you can show that first slide. I'm just trying to make sense of it's a bit like, with the whole COVID thing itself. Once we have flattened the curve, we can talk about more, or let's say the governments can talk about measures. It says here I'm muted by the host. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Sorry, that was my mistake.
Perfect.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, all good. So obviously, when we look at away from the pandemic, obviously here in Switzerland, we now have, I'm not sure if it's stable, but we have more hospital releases than we have new patients being submitted. So that's obviously very good news, right? So, and I'm just looking onto some of this the same, but from a different perspective when we talk about airline schedules. So the really good, the really bad news is there was never during this crisis less capacity scheduled. You can see that if you look at these, it's at the very beginning, it's a bit of an abstract graph here. But if you look at it, blue was 16th of March, then one red was 23rd, 30th was green, and now we're obviously the lowest chart or graph is as of yesterday, and that shows the total capacity that was scheduled. And 16th of March, what is COVID? No one knew, right? And then it slowly started with the reductions, and we're now really at where I'm not sure if we have hit the bottom yet, but we're obviously on a level where we can't go that much further down. So let's say we are close to the bottom. Good news here is that the airlines are, how shall I say, they're not, well, obviously things are really, really bad, but they're not, it's not like they have given up yet. So they're actually still, there's still a lot of hope there, because you can see that within a month, they've literally only taken out production until the beginning, second week of May. And then obviously end of May, with what they have scheduled, they would almost be close again to pre-crisis numbers. So this is the good thing, or this is what I want to emphasize, is that when we talk about silver lining, is that the airlines haven't given up yet, and they still have a lot of flights scheduled as of 1st of May. Obviously, once we get closer to that date, and obviously once every week, those numbers go down there again. But it's not like they have given up and said, okay, well, they've made statements, right? And we will not fly in May, and we will not fly in June, and whatever. But none of them dared to fly all of their aircraft far away and to park them there and say, okay, 1st of September, we start again. They're all sitting there waiting. And the moment we see releases in measures and then and openings again, I think they are rather quickly able to react to it. Maybe we can go very quickly go through this. So this is on a global scale. I think the next one shows Asia. This is quite, it's not such a good news, but it's obviously interesting as well, because it was two weeks ago, and I'm to be blamed for that as well. China is especially launched a big subsidies program to bring the airlines back flying. That didn't really work, so the airlines were flying empty. Passengers are just missing domestically. So the airlines in Asia have removed another 5 million seats again, compared to a week ago. So also in Asia, it's not all that bright yet, but it's obviously the market to watch first to really come back. So let's look about that. Europe, North America, the next slides, they all look pretty much the same. The one market that is not that optimistic is actually Oceania. I think that's my last slide already. So yeah, in Europe, you see it's the same thing. Africa, South America, it's always the same drop. And then beginning of May, first week, second week of May, they all plan to come back. The only ones that are not planning like that is Oceania, where you can see that they're maybe more realistic. I don't know, but they are just not believing in the market that much than the others. So we see a bit of an increase till May, but then a significantly lower capacity than compared to pre-crisis. So Oceania, they're probably a bit more realistic, but also there, the trend is there that once we lift measures, they're planning to come back rather quickly. So that's my silver lining here. That's what I wanted to emphasize today. No matter how bad the situation looks like, or no matter how bad the data also looks like, there's always every crisis also has a big possibility or a big space for opportunities. Just from my own perspective, I mean, it's not like we're only dealing with airports and airlines and that kind of stuff, but also with the finance industry and all these guys that actually own the aircraft, and they've been desperate way before the crisis because they couldn't buy aircraft at the prices they wanted to buy them. So for them, this is now a fantastic opportunity to actually ramp up their portfolios if they have money and they can spend it. So yeah, every crisis also creates a lot of opportunities, and that's probably what we need. We all need to be very alert for, looking for it, and once the opportunity arises, to catch it, because obviously all of these airlines that also go bust now, they will leave space, and space is always good to start something new.
Absolutely. We have a very interesting question following up on what you have been just discussing from Joost. Do you think that airlines keep flights from May 4 onwards in the system in order to manage the huge workload, considering rebookings and cancellations? Can that be one of the reasons?
I mean, it's probably a mix of both. It's a mix of desperation, and it's a mix of hope. We'll have to. I mean, it's not like. Can you go back to Europe? Yeah. So if you go back to Europe, you can see that maybe if we compare it to 29th March till April 6th, it's just that they have this. It seems that they're always canceling everything 4 weeks in advance. So that really seems to be the modus of operandi right now. I don't think it's purely because of the workload. I mean, the workload also differs very much airline by airline based on how well they're digitalized. I really think 4 weeks is what they need from a near-term planning to actually ramp it up.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Joe.
But I might be wrong, right? That's why we're here. So if you are,
of course, yeah.
I always like my opinions to be challenged. So go ahead.
We're here to
give me a hard time.
We're here to share opinions, ideas, discussions. So, Joe, over to you. I know you have a last couple of slides to share with us.
To that question, I think to say airlines are doing it to avoid work is maybe a little unfair to airlines. I think everyone's trying to view a crystal ball right now, aren't they? And it's awful cloudy. We don't really know how this is going to go or what the future holds. And I think really airlines are just trying to do what they can. And that leads me nicely into my last little segment for today. Is about what airlines are doing and how they are thinking outside the box. And we've had so many good news stories from airlines that are showing how resilient they can be. So one of the things that is a major issue at the moment is obviously the lack of cargo capacity. As an example, I don't know, I assume it's relatively similar for the rest of the world, but here in the UK, around 95% of our inbound cargo arrives in the belly of passenger planes. So with so many fewer passenger planes operating, that was going to be a real problem. But as usual, our airline partners have stepped up. Virgin Atlantic, one of our favourite British airlines, they operated their first cargo-only flight at the end of March. So they took a 787-9 from London to JFK and ferried some pharmaceutical and medical products between the two destinations. And just this past week, it sent another Dreamliner over to Shanghai to bring back much needed PPE for the NHS here in the UK. And of course, they're not the only one at all. There's been airlines all over Europe really stepping up to do what needs to be done. Air Baltic flew an A220 for an incredible 7 hours to China in order to transport medical supplies for their communities. And Aegean Airlines repurposed some of its A320 family aircraft. They took out all of the seats, which obviously gave them more capacity to start shifting cargo. And Wizz Air flew some 9,000 kilometers to China with an A321neo to collect medical supplies for Hungary. So, it's great to see airlines thinking outside of the box, and obviously for them, it's incredibly important because there are no passenger revenues right now. So anything they can do to generate a bit of income for the airline is really necessary. Could we move on to the next one, please, Juraj? So one of the most interesting ones we've been watching is Aer Lingus. This is an airline that's never flown to Asia before, and it now flies 5 times a day. So it's got a fleet of 10 A330s flying from Dublin to Beijing to bring back medical supplies. And every flight has 5 pilots on board. That's 2 captains and 3 first officers. They also take 2 engineers and a loadmaster who's responsible for packing the aircraft. And the reason they have so many pilots is so they don't have to stop, because obviously if they stop, they have to be accommodated, which not only adds to the cost, but also to the risk of picking up an infection while they're on that mission. So yeah, they're flying some 28 million euros worth of medical supplies per flight. And they're bringing back things like goggles, masks, gowns, gloves, and around 100,000 coronavirus testing kits every week. So they're actually using, I wanted to highlight these cargo bags, which are really cool. They really increase the capacity for aircraft to use the passenger seats to transport goods. And on the subject of cargo bags, last Friday we saw the certification pushed through by EASA for the new cargo bags for the A320 family. And you know, they pushed that through very quickly because they know that airlines need to be able to use their aircraft for this sort of mission. So that was really good to see. Sorry, my just final slide, please, Juraj. So just a couple more highlights. Airbus are moving cargo themselves. They used the A330-800 testbed to move some cargo, which was really exciting to see because obviously it's not actually delivered to any airlines yet. Heathrow is setting itself up as a cargo hub, prioritising flights with essential supplies. And displaced EasyJet and Virgin cabin crew are being asked to volunteer to work in the new NHS Nightingale hospitals. You know, obviously their wages are being covered to some extent by the very generous offer from our Chancellor, but it's also giving them a purpose, which I'm sure is much needed at the moment. And just the final picture there, somebody asked me earlier why there's a twin otter on my slide. This is Scottish regional airline Loganair, and they've been asked to step up with their twin otter to use as an air ambulance to get people quickly of your own. So just to summarize, it's not a good time for aviation, not at all, but I do think these are illustrations of how airlines are really thinking outside the box and, you know, doing some positive things to provide vital services.
100%. Thanks a lot, Joe, for sharing all this interesting and inspirational stuff with us.
Thank you.
Dirk, finally over to you. I know you have some also inspirational story to share with us from overseas, how one of the major airlines is communicating about the new norm of the industry, which would be clean.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure a lot of you have seen was Delta's Delta Clean video, which they put out several days ago. One of the things that interested me was that actually appeared on my YouTube channel as a promoted video. So Delta was obviously putting some money behind it to position this. And if you've seen the short video, it talks about how Delta is saying that how the standards that they're introducing now will be standards that they're going to carry on post COVID-19. Which looks on ahead, and this is obviously something that Chloe talked about as well, how consumer perceptions in things such as hygiene, and not being sort of in an environment where there's other people who might be potentially sick or contagious, or on the same vicinity as you, and they recognize that this is going to be a consumer message going forward. So they've made a commitment to various things such as fogging domestic as well as international aircraft, having enhanced cleaning of their aircraft, and having cabin crew being given the power to carry out spot checks and to be able to pause boarding and to have the cleaning crew brought back on if they see something that's amiss or if the cleaning standards aren't up to standard. So it's quite a smart move by Delta and starting to look ahead and to think, how will passengers feel when they start flying again in the post-COVID-19 world? Of course, there's a second issue, which is this is a challenge to the LCCs, because if you have if your whole business model is dependent on a turnaround of 30 or 40 minutes, it's going to be very, very difficult to to introduce those same standards that an airline such as Delta is doing. So it'll be interesting to see how they react, and whether Delta's move will in the post-COVID-19 world will actually cause passengers to gravitate towards airlines which are seen as the most cleanest, the most hygienic, and have the best sanitation standards.
Thanks a lot for sharing with us also this information. We are already running out of time, so just one more question from the audience. Actually, my colleague Tony is asking, Maybe Max, maybe you can react. Well, who do you think will be the first airlines to bring the capacity back? Who will be the quickest players, let's say, here in Europe after the skies are open?
That's a very good question. I mean, I obviously don't know the internal systems they have, but obviously the ones, there's two answers to that. Obviously the most desperate ones, because they need to earn money. And then obviously the ones with the best systems and the ones that kept the aircraft close. I think any airline that is still standing once this is over will be back in the air rather sooner than later. So obviously, I mean, this is one of the silver linings as well out of this. Before we had the crisis, everyone was talking about how bad the perception of the airlines was bad, and it still might be bad afterwards. But I mean, I'm in the industry for 10 years now, and I've never seen so much government support and so much reassurance how important airlines are. So there's probably also the silver lining out of all this, that the governments are out of a sudden very well remembered or reminded how important their airlines actually are. So maybe this is also something to take away after the crisis, that the governments hopefully appreciate the airlines a bit more and the important service they play for our well-being, right, of the world economy.
Absolutely, 100%. Okay, thank you very much, Joe, Chloe, Dirk, Max, for sharing all interesting insights, facts and figures and stories with us today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you everybody who joining us today in the audience. Before we say goodbye, I have an invitation for you for tomorrow. Speaking of AvGeeks, definitely tomorrow is the time for you. We have prepared an aviation quiz. So my colleague Mike Robinson has created really interesting 40 questions. So either you consider your AvGeek or not, you can still join us for a nice afternoon, 2 o'clock London time tomorrow, aviation quiz, just to test your knowledge and spend some nice together with the community again, as we did today. And so that's for tomorrow. Definitely join us for the quiz, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with the classic AviaDev Europe webinar on Tuesday, 21st April, again 1 o'clock London time, and we'll be talking about things from the tourism perspective. So we will have some really experienced guys on the webinar from the tourism side of things. So again, thanks a lot everybody for joining us. Thank you to all the speakers. Stay safe, happy Easter holidays, and all the best. Take care.